The sun was rising over the ridge, painting the jagged landscape in molten gold. The two CL snipers lay side by side in the brittle dirt of a dried riverbed, their rifles pressed tight against their shoulders, scopes cutting narrow tunnels of clarity through the morning haze. Every breath was measured, slow and deliberate, timed to the steady beat of hearts that had been trained to ignore fear. Ahead of them, through shattered stone walls and crooked beams, an enemy squad moved with mechanical caution. 6 men, rifles slung, silhouettes flickering in and out of sight as they passed through the ruins of a broken village. The snipers watched, memorizing pace, distance, patterns. They had the advantage: height, cover, the rising sun at their backs. Everything leaned in their favor. The wind whispered over the ridge. A small shift. Barely a tremor in the air, yet enough to bend trajectories. They accounted for it, adjusted their dials, moved their reticles a hair's width. But even the most seasoned can miscalculate when the atmosphere itself conspires. Fingers curled against triggers. The moment stretched thin as glass. One synchronized breath held. Then 2 rifles barked, thunder cracking across the emptiness. Instead of dropping, the enemy scattered. A man jerked, stumbled, but did not fall. Another shouted, ducking into cover, spraying wild bursts of fire at ghosts. The element of surprise evaporated in a heartbeat. The snipers cursed under their breath, chambering new rounds, but the perfect moment was gone, shattered by the wind and a fraction of error. The fighter vanished into the maze of ruins, alert now, dangerous. Radios stayed silent. No calls for backup. The plan, rehearsed and trusted, fell apart in seconds. The SEALs pressed themselves flatter into the earth. Hearts pounding in frustration, their breaths coming quicker despite years of training. The dry soil bit into their lips, filled their mouths with dust. But they didn't move. To lift their heads now would invite death. They could hear distant boots pounding against stone. The guttural calls of men organizing, hunting. The mission's spine had snapped. All they could do was wait, hidden and helpless. The sting of failure heavier than the packs on their shoulders. Somewhere beyond the walls of rock and ruin, the battle moved on without them, leaving them in silence, tasting what it meant for the first time in years to miss. At the farthest edge of the crumbling village, where the walls of a collapsed bakery leaned against each other like tired old men, a figure crouched in the shadows and listened. He had not worn the uniform in years, yet the habits were buried too deep to forget. The distant rifle cracks reached him first, sharp and echoing, followed by the sudden silence that meant shots had gone wrong. He knew the rhythm of combat, the way noise swelled and then died when luck betrayed the shooters. From his hiding place, he saw the silhouettes of the SEALs retreating down the dry riverbed, shoulders low, their failure heavy enough to be read in their movement. He did not blame them, he only understood. Sometimes the wind itself turned traitor. He was not dressed for war. A faded jacket hung loose around his wary frame, the cuffs frayed, one button missing. His hands were darkened with old burns, his nails chipped, the fingers strong in the way of men who had lifted too many loads and carried too much memory. A scar ran across his cheek, pale against sun, dried skin. Nothing about him suggested power or rank, only endurance. Yet his eyes told a different story. Eyes that did not blink when tracking motion, eyes that had learned long ago to measure distance without glass, to weigh time in heartbeats. The enemy squad was close now, moving through the ruins with confidence born of recent survival. They were young, loud, their boots crunching on broken tile, as if daring anyone to challenge them. The man behind the bakery studied them, noting the spacing, the weapons slung across their shoulders, the careless gestures of soldiers who believed they had already won. He did not feel fear. He felt a tightening in his chest that was older than fear, something that belonged to a vow made long ago in the dust of another country, another war. He checked the rifle he carried, an old bolt action with scratches etched deep into the stock. Each mark carried a memory, some names he could still recall, others blurred into the fog of time. He counted the remaining rounds in his pocket with quiet fingers, lips moving silently as if in prayer. 6 men, perhaps 7. He had fewer bullets than that, but bullets were not the only weapon left to him. Patience was sharper, cunning was heavier, promises weighed more than lead. He adjusted the sling, breathed once, and rose from his crouch, moving toward the ruins with the steady grace of a man who had already lived through his own death once before. He didn't come at them head-on, not like the young do when their blood runs hot. Instead, he circled, moving through alleys of broken brick and roofless houses where weeds had grown taller than men. Every step was calculated, toes finding earth instead of stone, body slipping into shadows as though he had rehearsed this terrain for years. The enemy squad had chosen a courtyard with cracked walls and a dry cistern at its center. They set down their packs carelessly, weapons resting against doorframes, and let themselves laugh. The sound carried through the ruins, harsh and careless, like they had already declared ownership of the place. He stayed back, crouched low, watching. Not one movement escaped his attention. The way one man favored his left leg, the constant itch of another's hand on his trigger, betraying nerves. The leader's short, clipped commands. He stored it all. He waited for the smallest crack to open. It came in the shape of a lighter's flare. A young fighter flicked it open, a thin flame snapping into life in the dusk. To anyone else it was nothing, but to him it was an opportunity, a signal, however unintentional, a beacon that marked a man too careless to deserve his position. He stooped, picked up a pebble from the ground, and sent it whistling through the air. It struck metal. The flame died with a surprised grunt, leaving only muttered curses and muffled laughter. A disruption. Small and forgotten by the enemy almost immediately, but he knew what it meant. They could be touched. They were not untouchable. From there he moved toward the cistern where their rucks and crates lay piled. Every second was dangerous. If one of them turned his head, the night would erupt in fire. But they didn't look. Arrogance blinded them more than shadows ever could. He adjusted a strap on a pack so it would slip loose under weight. He loosened a single screw on the base of a mounted weapon, leaving it steady enough to fool, but weak enough to fail when needed most. He tipped one crate just enough that its contents pressed against the edge, ready to spill at the first careless tug. Each act was a whisper, sabotage so quiet it felt like he was writing a secret letter to the coming chaos. When he finally stepped back into cover, he let the air out of his lungs slowly. He hadn't fired a shot. He hadn't needed to. The battlefield was now wired with invisible threads only he could see, waiting for the right hand to tug. Night arrived like a curtain dropped over the ruins, swallowing color and sound until only shapes remained. The veteran became another shadow among many, his outline breaking apart with each careful movement. He didn't rush. He never had. Patience had carried him through years others hadn't survived, and it would serve him again now. He slid past broken archways, brushed against walls scarred with old bullet holes, and reached the point where he could see the courtyard clearly. The enemy squad had settled into their camp, their voices lower now, their confidence diluted by darkness. Still, they laughed, ate, and muttered stories in a language he barely remembered, men clinging to routine to push away unease. He listened, learned, and waited. His first move was small, barely noticeable. He loosened an old chain from a rusted bicycle leaning against a collapsed wall, then strung it low across a doorway. It was a simple trap, not designed to maim but to trip, to stall, to spread panic. A few steps farther he found a broken can of oil and tilted it just enough to spill into the stone corridor. The slick sheen gleamed faintly even in the moonlight, a trap for boots too quick. These weren't weapons meant to kill, they were threads in a larger web. When the time felt right, he created his opening. He picked up a chunk of steel and slammed it against a gate. The echo booming through the ruins like footsteps multiplied. Immediately shouts erupted. One fighter jerked awake and fired into the dark, bullets sparking off walls. Another shouted, "Contact," without knowing where to aim. The squad scrambled, tripping over each other, eyes wide with fear of an enemy they could not see. The veteran moved with precision through their chaos. He slid behind cover, raised his old rifle, and put a single round into a fuel can leaning near their fire. The can didn't explode, but the sudden flare and hiss of burning liquid lit up their camp like lightning, shadows twisting and men scattering. He darted to another position, let a loose line of rope snap, and watched as it dropped a heavy sheet of metal onto one man's shoulders, pinning him in the dark. Another stumbled on the bike chain, falling hard, his weapon clattering out of reach. By the time the squad realized they were under attack, half of them were already disoriented, fighting ghosts. Radios buzzed with panicked voices, but static drowned their words. They fired into alleys, into nothing, wasting precious rounds. The veteran, unseen, simply breathed and moved, pulling each invisible thread in sequence. Watching the dominoes fall exactly as he had planned, silence returned slowly like dust settling after a storm. The courtyard was a graveyard of noise now. Weapons scattered, boots abandoned, fires guttering in oily smoke. The few fighters who could still move had broken off into the ruins, stumbling blindly, convinced they were surrounded by an army that didn't exist. Their voices faded into the night, leaving only the faint crackle of flames and the moan of the wind through hollow windows. From the crumbled roof of the bakery, the veteran sat in stillness, his rifle across his knees, eyes scanning the emptiness below. He did not smile. Victory was not a feeling he carried anymore. It was only another weight on top of many, one more reminder of the skills that had kept him alive long after he should have been gone. He studied the wreckage of the fight, the traps sprung exactly as he had placed them. A strap loosened on a ruck, spilling gear into the dirt where its owner had fled. The crate he had tilted lay burst open, its contents scattered across broken stone. The oil slick was smeared with boot prints and streaks of panic. Every detail was proof that patience had outlasted firepower. He hadn't needed to outshoot them, only outthink them. It was a lesson he had carried for decades, and tonight it had been written again in the ruins of another forgotten village. When he finally stood, his knees ached, and his back cracked under the weight of years. He slung the rifle across his shoulder, his fingers brushing the stock where a name had once been carved. Time had worn it faint, but he could still feel the grooves with his fingertips, still remember the face that belonged to it. That was why he fought. Not for glory, not for medals, not even for the men retreating down the riverbed who would never know he was here. He fought because of a promise whispered long ago, a promise that had outlasted war and peace alike. The horizon was already paling, dawn rising again to touch the ridges with gold. He descended from the bakery wall, each step steady, leaving behind no trace but footprints soon to be swallowed by dust. There would be no report of what he had done, no acknowledgement, no tale told around campfires. He preferred it that way. He was a man who existed between shadows, a ghost among ruins. As he walked into the breaking light, the world behind him grew quiet, and the battlefield, now empty, looked less like victory and more like memory.